Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? How far we've come in a year and a half. A Woman's Place UK has gone from protecting the rights we have to now fighting for those that we still lack. And among our demands are women's right to same-sex spaces and also our right to self-organisation. They are vital in themselves, but also as a means of destroying women's oppression by men, an oppression that is based on our biological sex as women and which socialises us in gendered ways. Working collectively as women to change this is feminism. We are feminists. And as feminists, we have a long and proud tradition to draw on, which I want to talk about this evening. But feminism, like the definition of woman, has been an object of suspicion and even hate for the opponents of women's sex-based rights. I want to talk briefly about where this hostility comes from, drawing on what's been taught in UK and US universities over the past 30 years. Some of what I say may sound esoteric, to put it generously, but 2, almost 3 generations of students have been educated to see the world in a certain way. They are now the teachers, journalists, civil servants and politicians seeking to negotiate the current debate over whether women exist and whether we should have rights. We need to understand how their education has influenced their worldview if we are to set the record straight. Suspicion of feminism owes much to postmodernism, which began to prevail in British and US universities after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Dressed up as radically progressive, this is really the acceptable face of neoliberalism. Many students were and are taught that people cannot break out of the confines of capitalism, though this is a strange form of capitalism in which language, rather than money, makes the world go round. People cannot change the world, but individually they can alter their relationship to it through their self-description and performance of gender. No reality exists other than self-description. By this logic, feminists brought women's oppression into being by naming it. Feminism prevented people from being queer and gender fluid by insisting on the reactionary category woman. Over the past 30 years, students have studied collective movements less and individuals' identities and emotions and feelings more. While individual choice is celebrated, the very notion of collectivity has become deemed as oppressive. Revealingly, in our neoliberal times, it's the socialist, labour and feminist movements of the world that have been most strongly attacked. The leaders of feminist movements were, it is claimed, attempting to dominate those they purported to represent. The world was and is a collection of self-interested individuals seeking to dominate others or trying to avoid domination themselves. In the words of that great postmodern theorist Margaret Thatcher, there really is no such thing as society. We're now seeing what Sheila Jeffreys rightly said in the 1990s would be the logical conclusion of this. We have the rise of scholarship on transgender people in the past and museum and gallery celebrations of queerness. These university courses and exhibitions are not, of course, replacing the older focus on privileged white men, but rather taking over the limited space that we'd fought to create for women's history. Often, these queer histories involve appropriating lesbian history, as the transwashing of lesbians' contribution to Stonewall's establishment shows. This is one glaring example of why we need single-sex feminist spaces and organisations. It is only due to the feminists of the 60s, 70s and 80s that we really know anything about women's achievements in the past and that they have been put on the public record. Now we have to make a stance to do that in our own time. The attempt to reclaim transgender ancestors, which is indulged in by today's trans activists and their allies in academia, is deeply ahistorical. Transgender ideology argues that biological sex does not exist and that gender is a personal identity brought into being by self-description. These claims simply do not speak to the experience of people in the past. Before the late 20th century, gender and sexuality were widely understood as determined by one's biological sex. That's why some lesbians understood their sexuality as a biological inversion. That biological sex does not determine gender was revealed by feminists, not by postmodernists, in the 1970s and 80s. They showed that the very existence of gender is due to historically specific, unequal relationships between men and women. Male oppression of women predates capitalism, but in capitalist societies certainly, women's biological role as actual and potential mothers, and therefore as reproducers of labour power, explains their oppression as a sex. Gender and sex are connected by the exercise of male power over women. Social and cultural gender roles harm and constrain all of us, but have particularly helped to control women. This analysis of power, who holds it, how and why, is often lacking in university teaching. Power is presented as diffuse and operated through language. Feminists can, by that logic, hold as much power as white male capitalists. But gender was not and is not an identity freely chosen. Gender norms are meant to keep people, particularly women, in our place. The minority of people who lived as members of the opposite sex in the past did not make this choice freely, and very often articulated that fact. Frequently, they were lesbians or gay men who faced social opprobrium, or worse, if they did not conceal either their sexuality or their sex. Others did so for equally material reasons. One of the most famous cases, often cited in exhibitions and university courses, is that of Lilias Barker, a woman born in late 19th century Britain who lived much of her adult life as a man, was jailed for marrying another woman, and became a freak show on Blackpool Pier. On one of the rare occasions that Barker was allowed to speak for herself away from court and salacious press reports, she explained that she had begun living as a man because it was easier for men to earn a living than for a woman to do so. This reasoning, which reflected women's lack of economic power, is usually ignored by those who celebrate Barker. Instead of studying why women had and have so little power, Barker is celebrated as queer, someone who was able to express their sexuality. But if women can only be economically independent, behave as they like, or love who they want by living as men, this tells us that they live in a society where gendered roles are very rigid and oppressive. If we find ourselves in a society where many women apparently want to live as men, as is true among teenagers today, an appropriate response is not to embrace, but to challenge those gender roles, and even more important, to smash the structures of oppression that underpin them. And good news. Feminist history reveals that women can and have done just this. They do it not through shopping for certain kinds of clothes or dyeing their hair blue, but through solidarity, understanding that it is action, not personal identity, that takes us to a better world, and that united we stand, divided we fall. The notion that feminism creates male oppression of women by naming it ignores something: reality. Feminist movements have never come out of nowhere. They are provoked by sexism. Take late 19th century Britain, an example I'm using because it's so often peddled out as a sign that feminism is only ever about the white middle class. As men's education, employment and suffrage rights increased in 19th century Britain, feminists responded to women's exclusion from these. They also reacted to new threats to women's few freedoms. A scare over male syphilis in the army led to the forcible inspection of women, not men of course, for venereal disease. Women suspected of being prostitutes could simply be pulled off the streets and subjected to invasive examination. The government also debated legalising brothels. Feminists recognised that prostitution exists for men's interests, not women's, and they campaigned against brothels and for women's right to walk freely on the street without arrest or assault. Often, this group are portrayed as regulating and dominating working class women. And more generally, there are groups of queer theorists and postmodern scholars who see any form of legislation or state intervention as highly problematic. You only need to read the wonderful manifesto that A Woman's Place UK is putting out today to realise that we need legislation and we need the state if we're going to get what we want. But under their logic, by naming something, you essentialise it. Now, obviously there are conflicts within the trans activist movement about this. In some ways they want legislation for their own ends. But take the example of birth certificates and the idea that sex should not be included in the birth certificate anymore. That's a prime example of what I'm talking about here. The idea that if we name something, we're somehow essentialising people and restricting them. Okay, if that's true, then before birth certificates were introduced into the UK in 1837, there would have been no sex oppression, right? Unfortunately, a quick skim of Mary Wollstonecraft's writing, who died 30 years earlier, shows that sadly, sexism was already existent. The other thing that kind of criticism of those women ignores is that many of those same women, those same feminists, were also active in campaigns for the vote, for women's trade union representation, and for women's education. Many also worked alongside male comrades in the labour movement and against imperialism. Differences of opinion did exist between feminists. Class and race inequalities that exist in wider society were and are reflected in social and political movements. And yes, we should and need to work harder to overcome this. It was certainly a movement dominated by white middle-class women, but connections were made with, for example, Indian feminists campaigning for freedom from imperial rule alongside women's political citizenship. Despite their differences, thousands of women in Britain and across the world found common cause in fighting their oppression. That was because they, like we, understood that woman is not a monolithic identity, but an experience that we are born into and live, and that it is that experience which binds us together as feminists. Alongside these political campaigns, many women established single-sex spaces in which they could be safe from male exploitation and could collectively create the opportunities that men denied them. They established girls' schools and women's colleges, maternity clinics and nurseries. The first maternity clinics in Britain were pioneered by women in the co-op and labour movement, artistic and cultural ventures, and nurtured women's same-sex relationships. When you are excluded from the centres of power and oppressed by those who control them, it makes sense to organise autonomously. Exclusion per se is not unfair. We need to understand context and power. Women's exclusion of men is not exclusion by a dominant class, as statistics on sexual violence, the sex pay gap, and women's woeful political representation show. That's why we still need single-sex spaces and the right to self-organise. In contrast to this history of self-organisation, trans activism, like neoliberalism, simply offers us individual choice. We can change ourselves, but nothing else. Not only is this woefully unambitious and nihilistic, but the doctrine of choice adds to women's oppression. For it is women who now shoulder the burden of choosing social care for their dependents in the absence of a robust welfare state, and the unpaid labour of care when no provider is available. It is women who are now spending more time in active parenting than they did in the 1970s, despite also doing more hours of paid work, because they are expected to choose their child's school, friends and extracurricular activities in order to give them a head start in the great marketplace of life. And if that seems divorced from trans ideology, let's reflect on the pressure that mothers face from those who claim that a good parent will unquestioningly support their child's choice to transition. Of course, once you've lost your breasts and become infertile, gender may not feel so crazily fluid after all. Mothers will be the ones there to pick up the pieces when the trans activists and their allies have walked away. Historically, many feminists have fought for the right to act outside gendered norms and in accordance with your sexuality. But they understand that individual choices over how to behave or describe yourself do not overcome oppression. Feminist movements have. To those who claim feminism achieved nothing more than the dominance of a few white middle-class women, I say, go tell that to the women who organised against imperial rule in Latin America and Asia. Tell that to those black women who fought for sex as well as race equality in the US and South African civil rights movements. Tell it to the Grunwick strikers of the 1970s, those South Asian women who enacted one of Britain's longest-running industrial disputes and showed that it is possible to forge solidarity across the divisions of sex and race while respecting the right of women to self-organise. And frankly, tell it to those white middle-class women who fought for our right to walk the streets, have an education and a vote. Feminist movements are as varied in tactics as they are in membership. Many women I know are frustrated that they can't be more involved in today's movement, often feeling that the hostility feminists face will harm their livelihood or families. And it's a tribute to everyone in this room that we're doing as much as we can to make sure that that fear goes away. But the past shows us that we do need militant action and those who can speak out publicly. But feminism has always relied too on those who use their work and their research to change hearts and minds, those who write trade union resolutions and articles, and those who give care, hugely undervalued in capitalism and patriarchy, to those women in the firing line. And when we look back at the suffrage movements or inspiring rallies in halls like this one, we know that every woman there made a difference. I suspect that over the past year, we have all had moments of despair. But our past shows that from such movements can spring glorious movements, and that from such moments can spring forth glorious movements and lasting change. 5 years ago, I would not have dreamt that I would stand together tonight with hundreds of feminists, confident that we are just the tip of an international movement that is growing for women's rights. And by owning our history, we have something that feminists in the past did not possess. They rarely knew much about the feminist campaigns that preceded them. That history wasn't present in schools, museums, or libraries. But we do. We know that those feminists who went before us were reviled, as we are, but we also know that they won important victories. That struggle, their struggle, continues. And here today, on the 20th of May 2019, we are also making history. Standing in sisterhood with those who went before us, we can say with confidence, we too shall fight and we're going to win. Thank you.